World War I, the Great War, the Weltkrieg. Weltkrieg? Call it what you may, this war changed everything. Before the seminal catastrophe, Europeans saw themselves as divine, a people of civilization and peace. But after the horrors of the war, this idea was smashed. Dying in war was seen as the most admirable way to die, but after millions waited in months on end in trenches, unable to stand all the way up, covered in mud and soot, just to die in a hole, this idea was smashed as well. After 4 years, technically 5, but 1919 saw no combat in the major fronts of the war, the Entente powers came in on top. Well, most of them did. But this was not the set-in-stone outcome of the war. The Central Powers could have came out on top and asserted themselves as the champions of Europe. Today we'll be exploring this scenario, but first, the how. In our timeline, the Germans had a plan to win the war against the Entente powers, the Schieffelin Plan. Focus their forces on a swift victory over France by moving through Belgium and seizing Paris, then refocus everything on Russia. Why did they do this? They overestimated the Russians. Russia is and has always been massive. It yields a population of equal size, and the Germans were terrified of it. Failing to see the detrimental social and infrastructural issues going against the Russians, the Germans saw them as only defeatable if all forces were focused on them. For this to be the case, France would have to fall. However, even in our timeline, the Germans, after being bogged down just outside of Paris, had only ended up making any gains in the east against Russia. So what if this had been their doctrine? Hold the French with a smaller amount of the army at the border at Alsace-Lorraine and focus the majority of forces on taking out the Russians. The Germans in our timeline pushed into France through the heavily fortified border they shared near the beginning of the war. This was at a time when defense was a much easier and effective strategy than offense. The Germans could easily hold off the French without sustaining too many casualties, allowing the Imperial Army to focus on the Russian bear. By 1914, the Russian Empire was in turmoil. After the defeat at the hands of the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, their pride was broken and flaws in their army and infrastructure were exposed. So were these issues fixed by 1914? No. The Russian railway system was a joke compared to the rest of Europe, and their army was undersupplied. Not only this, but dissent against the Tsar of Russia amongst the people was already high at the outset of the war, and once they started losing in our timeline, the Russians revolted. Twice, leading to a years-long civil war and their surrender to the Germans and Central Powers. In this timeline, the Germans make quick and easy gains before the Russians can mobilize. But even when the Russian army is ready for war, the Germans easily trump it, as they did in our timeline. Seeing this, the French would mount an offensive to try to end the war quickly. This was not a uniquely German concept. They would be stalled as the German defenses turned into trench warfare as the French defenses did in our timeline. The first year of the war would see high casualties on the French side and territorial losses on the Russians. The following spring, the Russians would attempt to get their act together, but would be once again defeated in battles and would be back on the retreat. I know it seems like I'm not cutting the Russians enough slack, but this happened in our timeline, and it would be amplified in this one. As the Baltics are seized and the Germans near St. Petersburg, dissent against the Tsar would reach a new peak as he led the Russia into a war that they just could not win. Nicholas would be deposed and the new provincial government would be set up. Just in our timeline, this new government keeps fighting. However, unlike in our timeline, they see zero against the Germans, whose morale and numbers are higher than ever in our timeline. Now let's talk about Britain. In our timeline, Britain joined the war after the Germans violated Belgian neutrality and invaded to get around the French. In this timeline, the Germans haven't done this. Does this mean the British stay out? Most definitely not. After seeing the massive victories the Germans have over the Russians and the French inability to push into Germany, the British declare war on the Central Powers to try to stop a German hegemony in Europe. Now the two Western powers, seeing Russia on its last legs, would mount a decisive offensive to try and finally break the Germans and save Russia. Casualties would be massive. The British and French would throw everything they had at the Germans. It would most likely be the single bloodiest day in human history. The Germans may need to divert some troops to the west, but they would most likely hold against the Entente. Seeing this, as well as the provincial government still fighting this losing war, the Russians revolt again. Like in our timeline, the Bolsheviks take power and make peace with the Germans, starting the Russian Civil War and ending war on the Eastern Front for the Germans. What would this peace look like? Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Cossacks, and even the Crimea would all become independent states from the Russian Empire. However, they would be deeply tied socially and economically to the Germans, turning them into puppets. Hearing of the Russian surrender, the German morale greatly improves while the Entente plummets. They had wasted a lot of men in the last push and now had to wait as the Western German army was emboldened and they were inevitably attacked. This offensive, they would know, would most definitely be a victory for the Germans. There are most likely talks of surrender in the population of the Entente nations, however the troops remain, preparing to defend. However, at this point, the Germans would now invade through Belgium to bring the war to an end. Knowing victory to be almost certain, they would also seize Luxembourg City. Attacks on the French-German border would commence as the Entente army rushed to defend Paris. Due to Allied disorganization, these would most likely be even more victories for the Central Powers, though they would be bloody ones. Belgium would last probably just as long in this timeline. That is, not very long, but they would put up some resistance. The defense of Paris would be set up in this time. After the capitulation of Belgium, the Germans would rush towards the French capital. A desperate defense of Paris would take place as it did in our timeline. However, the fully supplied, emboldened Germans would be at this point an unstoppable force. From Paris you could hear the approaching fighting in aircraft, until the city itself is hit with bombardments of shells. After bloody fighting, the Entente defense would break, and for the second time in 50 years, Paris would fall to the Germans. Any effort to continue fighting would be met with riots and protests. The surrender of all Entente forces would shortly follow. Now the peace. The Germans would most likely not take too much land in Western Europe. In mainland Europe, France would only lose a few miles of territory as the Germans pushed slightly further into France proper. Luxembourg would be annexed. Belgium would lose a slight bit of territory, but its government would be replaced and its monarch would be as well. This would practically and symbolically turn it into a German puppet. The real changes would be colonial. The German plan for African reorganization was called Middle Africa. Their 4 African colonies were to be connected to form a large central German-African entity. Papua New Guinea would be united under German rule, and they may take some Indian territory. The French would face war reparations to keep them from challenging Germany as they set up the new world order around themselves. Now we come to Britain. After the horrors of war, the British people would most likely devote themselves to isolating themselves from the rest of Europe, but the Germans would need to make sure. The only reason the British would interfere is because of their safety behind their navy. The Germans would force them to navally disarm and would restrict them from any buildup in the future. This, along with colonial possessions being taken away, would weaken the British tremendously, taking them from a superpower to a vulnerable island with a smaller colonial empire and nothing protecting themselves from invasion if they were to find themselves in conflict with the new power, Germany. Finally, let's talk about the other members of the Central Powers, Bulgaria and the dying empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans. If the Italians joined the side of the Entente like they did in our timeline, the Austrians would most likely not be able to take much land from them. The last thing they needed was more unhappy people of other races rather than Austrian in their quickly collapsing state. The same goes for Serbia and Montenegro. A little territory would be gained and reparations would be paid, but the Austrians would be in no position to take any more. Now the Ottomans. They surely took some Russian territory in the Cossacks, but would find themselves in the same position as the Austrians. Their prize was their continued existence, some reparations, and maybe some British colonies in the Middle East and Cyprus. They would also probably take back their lost land of Libya from the Italians. Bulgaria would take the Greater Macedonia region from the Serbs and Greeks and would bask in a new wave of nationalist fever and pride. And so the pen is put to paper and the treaty is signed. Some empires survive that didn't in our timeline, some still die. But the world is forever changed, and the Germans can shape it however they please. What would follow the end of this decisive conflict? Well, we'll explore that next time.